She stood at the courthouse door with dust on her boots and a marriage contract in her fist. Marrying a stranger wasn't her first choice, but losing her father's land sure as hell wasn't an option. Colt Riker didn't want a wife. Alara Vance didn't want a husband. But Ridge Hollow's law didn't care what women wanted, and the vultures were already circling. This wasn't love. This was survival dressed up in a handshake and a lie. If you want to see how two people who can't stand each other end up fighting the same war, stay with me until the end, and hit that like button. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Viki. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and older lies. Alara sat with her spine straight and her jaw tight, staring at the man across the desk like she could burn a hole through his forehead if she focused hard enough. Mr. Pettigrew, thin as a rail, glasses perched on a nose that looked like it had been broken twice, cleared his throat for the third time in as many minutes. Miss Vance, I understand this is difficult, but the law is quite clear on the matter. The law, Alara said, her voice flat, is a damn convenience for men like Victor Hale. Pettigrew flinched. He shuffled the papers in front of him, not meeting her eyes. Your father's will stipulates that the ranch passes to you, yes. However, given that you are an unmarried woman, the county requires a man's signature. She didn't ask. She knew. A legal guardian or spouse to co-sign all property transactions and loans. It's meant to protect. Protect, Alara laughed, short and bitter. Right. Protect me from what exactly? Managing the same land I've been running since I was 16? Pettigrew said nothing. He just sat there, swimming in his own discomfort. Outside, Ridge Hollow baked under a June sun that had no mercy. Horses stamped and snorted at the rail. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked itself hoarse. Alara's father had been dead 3 weeks, and she'd barely had time to bury him before the paperwork started piling up like a landslide. Debts she didn't know existed. Liens on equipment she'd thought was paid off. And now this fresh humiliation wrapped up in legal language. She stood abruptly. The chair scraped loud against the floor. Thank you for your time, Mr. Pettigrew. He blinked up at her. Miss Vance, if you don't secure a signature within 30 days, the bank will have grounds to... I know what they'll have grounds to do. She left before he could say another word. The street outside was busy in that slow, grinding way frontier towns were busy, people moving with purpose but no particular hurry. Alara pulled her hat down low and started walking. Her boots kicked up dust with every step. She didn't look at anyone, and most folks had the sense not to look at her. Alara Vance had a reputation in Ridge Hollow, and it wasn't the kind that invited small talk. Her father's ranch sat 4 miles north of town, tucked against the hills where the scrub gave way to decent grazing land. It wasn't huge, 200 acres, give or take, but it was hers. Or it had been. Now it was a question mark with a deadline. She'd tried asking for help. That was the worst part. She'd swallowed her pride and gone to her father's old friends, men who'd shared whiskey with him, who'd worked cattle alongside him for years. They'd all said the same thing, in one form or another. It's a shame, Alara, real shame. But a woman running a ranch alone? That's just not how things work. She wanted to spit every time she thought about it. There was one option left, one name that kept surfacing every time she asked around, whispered like a bad idea people couldn't help but suggest. Colt Riker. Alara had never spoken to the man. Hell, she wasn't even sure she'd seen him up close. He lived on the far edge of the valley, where the land turned rough and the trees thickened. People said he'd been there 5 years, maybe 6, kept to himself. Didn't come to town except for supplies, and even then he was in and out before anyone could strike up a conversation. Some folks said he'd been a soldier. Others said he'd killed a man back east and run before the law could catch him. Nobody knew for sure, and Colt Riker sure wasn't offering explanations. But here's the thing. He was single. He was a man. And according to the law, that was all that mattered. Alara hated the idea before she even finished thinking it. She hated that it made sense. She hated that she was desperate enough to consider it. By the time she made it back to the ranch, the sun was starting its slow slide toward the horizon. The house looked smaller every time she came home now, like it was shrinking in on itself without her father's presence to fill it. She fed the horses, checked the fence line along the south pasture, and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that went cold in her hands. Marrying Colt Riker. It sounded insane when she said it out loud, but losing the ranch? That sounded worse. But she rode out to his place 2 days later. The road, if you could call it that, was more of a suggestion, winding through rock and brush until it dead-ended at a clearing that looked like it had been carved out by sheer stubbornness. Riker's cabin sat in the middle of it, low and solid, built from timber that had probably been milled on site. Smoke curled from the chimney even though it was near 80 degrees. Alara dismounted and tied her horse to a post. She waited. It didn't take long. The door opened and Colt Riker stepped out onto the porch, a rifle cradled loose in one arm. He didn't point it at her, but he didn't set it down either. He was taller than she'd expected, broader through the shoulders. His hair was dark, a little too long, and his face had the kind of stillness that came from practice. Nothing accidental about it. He looked at her the way you'd look at a stray dog that wandered into your yard, wary, calculating, not particularly interested. "You lost?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "No." "Then you're trespassing." Alara didn't flinch. "I need to talk to you." "Don't recall asking for company." "I'm not here to be your company." She crossed her arms. "I'm here to make you an offer." That got his attention. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "What kind of offer?" "The kind where we both get something we need." Colt stared at her for a long moment. Then he leaned the rifle against the doorframe and stepped down off the porch. He moved like someone used to being alone. No wasted motion, no hurry. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the scar running along his jaw, pale against sun-dark skin. "I'm listening." Alara took a breath. "I need a husband. You need—" She paused, realizing she had no idea what Colt Riker needed. "Whatever it is you need, land maybe, a legal claim to something, I don't know. But here's the deal. I marry you, you sign the papers the bank wants, and we keep our distance. You stay here, I stay at my place. No interference, no expectations, just two people with their names on the same piece of paper." Colt didn't react, didn't blink, just stood there, absorbing her words like they were rain and he was dust. Finally, he spoke. "Why me?" "Because you don't talk, you don't ask questions, and you don't seem like the type to get ideas." His mouth twitched. It might have been a smile, hard to tell. "Ideas about what?" "About thinking this means something it doesn't." Colt studied her for another long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin. Alara thought he was dismissing her, but he stopped at the door and glanced over his shoulder. "Come back tomorrow. I'll have an answer." "I need an answer now." "Then you're going to be disappointed." He went inside and shut the door. Alara stood there, furious and helpless in equal measure. She wanted to kick the door in. She wanted to scream, but she didn't do either. She just untied her horse, swung into the saddle, and rode back the way she came. Gates. Colt gave her his answer 3 days later. He showed up at her ranch just after dawn, riding a bay gelding that looked as no-nonsense as its owner. Alara was mucking out the barn when she heard hoofbeats. She stepped outside, pitchfork still in hand, and squinted at him through the early light. "Took you long enough." Colt dismounted. "Had to think about it." "And?" "I'll do it." Alara blinked. She hadn't actually expected him to say yes. "Just like that?" "You said no interference, no expectations. That true?" "Yeah." "Then yeah. I'll do it." He didn't elaborate, didn't explain, just stood there with his arms crossed, waiting for her to say something. Alara set the pitchfork down. "All right, we do this quick. No fuss. We go to the courthouse, sign the papers, and that's it." "Fine." "And we're clear. This doesn't mean anything. You go back to your place, I stay here. We're not—" She struggled for the word. "We're not actually married." Colt's expression didn't change. "Sounds like we are on paper." "You know what I mean." "I do." He untied a saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. "Contract. Wrote it myself. You sign, I sign. Makes it clear what this is." Alara unfolded it. The handwriting was surprisingly neat, precise, even. The terms were exactly what she'd outlined. No claims on each other's property, no cohabitation, dissolution of the arrangement once her ranch was secure and she no longer needed a legal signature. She looked up at him, You thought of everything. Seemed smart. It is. She found a pen, signed her name at the bottom, and handed it back. Colt signed it too, folded the paper, and tucked it back into his saddlebag. We do this Thursday, Elara said. Courthouse opens at 9. I'll be there. He turned to leave, but Elara called after him. Riker. He stopped. Why'd you say yes? Colt glanced back at her, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been understanding, or maybe just recognition. Because I know what it's like to need a way out. Then he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Elara standing in the dust with more questions than answers. Thursday came faster than she wanted. Elara wore the same dress she'd worn to her father's funeral, dark blue, plain, with buttons up to her collar. It felt like a costume. She braided her hair tight and pinned it up, even though it made her scalp ache. Colt was waiting outside the courthouse when she arrived. He'd cleaned up, shaved, combed his hair, wore a shirt that didn't look like it had been slept in. He nodded at her when she walked up. Ready? As I'll ever be. They went inside together. The clerk was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She looked between them like she was trying to solve a puzzle. You two getting married? Yes, Elara said. Witnesses? Don't have any. The clerk sighed. I'll fetch someone. She disappeared into the back and returned with a man Elara recognized, Tom Grady, the deputy sheriff. He grinned when he saw her. Well, well, Elara Vance getting hitched. Didn't think I'd see the day. Don't start, Tom. He raised his hands in mock surrender. Just here to witness, ma'am. The ceremony, if you could call it that, lasted all of 5 minutes. The clerk read from a book, asked if they consented, and had them sign the register. Colt's signature was as steady as hers was shaky. Tom signed as witness, still grinning like he'd just heard the best joke of his life. Congratulations, the clerk said dryly. You're married. Elara felt nothing, no relief, no dread, just a hollow sort of finality. They walked outside into the bright, unforgiving light. Colt stopped on the steps and looked at her. That's it then. That's it. I'll stay out of your way. Good. He started down the steps, and Elara thought that was the end of it. But then he paused and looked back. If you need something, anything, you let me know. Elara frowned. I thought we weren't interfering. We're not. But if you need something, I'm saying you can ask. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded. Colt tipped his hat and walked away. Elara stood there a moment longer, watching him go. Then she turned and headed for the bank, marriage certificate in hand, ready to shove it in the face of every man who'd told her she couldn't do this alone. She'd done it. She'd won. So why did it feel like she'd just made a deal with something she didn't fully understand? The first 2 weeks were easy because they didn't see each other. Elara threw herself into the work, fixing fence posts, rotating the cattle, overhauling the irrigation system her father had been too stubborn to touch. The ranch felt different now. Hers in a way it hadn't been before. She didn't have to ask permission, didn't have to justify her choices. She just worked until her hands bled and her back screamed, and then she worked some more. Colt stayed at his place. As far as she knew, nothing had changed for him, but people in town started talking. Heard you married Colt Riker, the grocer said when she came in for supplies. Yep. That's unexpected. Is it? The grocer shifted uncomfortably. Just didn't take you for the marrying type, Miss Vance, or Mrs. Riker. Elara paid for her flour and coffee and left without another word. It was the same everywhere she went. The blacksmith, the feed store, the post office. Everyone had an opinion, and none of them had the guts to say it to her face. But she could see it in their eyes, hear it in the pauses between their words. What's a woman like her doing with a man like him? Bet it won't last a month. Heard he doesn't even live with her. What kind of marriage is that? Elara ignored it. She had practice ignoring things. But then Victor Hale came calling. Interpretates. She was in the barn, greasing the wheel hubs on the wagon, when she heard the horse approach. She straightened, wiping her hands on a rag, and stepped outside. Hale sat on a chestnut mare that was too pretty for ranch work. He wore a suit, gray, tailored, and a hat with a brim so wide it probably had its own weather system. He smiled when he saw her, and it was the kind of smile that made her want to check her pockets. "Mrs. Riker," he said, voice smooth as river stones. "Congratulations are in order, I hear." "Mr. Hale." She didn't return the smile. "What do you want?" "Just a friendly visit. Thought I'd check in, see how you're managing." "Managing fine." "I'm sure you are. You're a resourceful woman." He dismounted, slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world. Still, running a ranch is no small task, especially for, well, let's say especially under current circumstances. If you've got a point, make it. Hale chuckled. Straight to business. I like that. He glanced around the property, taking in the barn, the house, the corrals. This is good land, Alara. Your father knew that. I knew that. Hell, everyone in Ridge Hollow knows that. But good land needs good management, and management needs capital. I've got capital. Do you? He looked at her, still smiling. Because from where I'm standing, you've got debt. Quite a bit of it, if the rumors are true. Alara's jaw tightened. My finances aren't your concern. Maybe not, but I'd hate to see this place go under because of pride. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. I'm prepared to make you an offer. A generous one. Buy the land outright, clear your debts, and you walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere else. He held out the envelope. Alara didn't take it. I'm not selling. Alara, I said I'm not selling. Hale's smile thinned. He tucked the envelope back into his jacket. I understand. You're attached to this place. Sentimental value and all that. But sentiment doesn't pay bills. Think about it. My offer stands. He tipped his hat and climbed back onto his horse. As he rode away, he called over his shoulder, Give my regards to your husband. I imagine he's busy. Alara watched him go, her hands clenched into fists. She should have expected this. Hale had been sniffing around her father's land for years, always with some new angle, some fresh pitch. But now, with her father gone, he thought she'd be easier to break. He was wrong. Still, the visit left her rattled. Not because she was afraid of Hale, she wasn't. But because he was right about one thing. Debt was real. And it was piling up faster than she could handle. She needed help, and she hated that she needed it. She rode to Colt's place that evening just as the sun was starting to set. The sky was streaked with red and orange, like something had been set on fire just beyond the hills. Colt was outside, chopping wood. He saw her coming and set the axe down, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Alara, we need to talk. He gestured toward the porch. All right. They sat on the steps, not close, but not distant either. Alara stared at the horizon, trying to figure out how to say what she needed to say without sounding desperate. Hale came by today. Colt's expression darkened. What did he want? To buy me out. Said he'd clear my debts if I sold him the ranch. You tell him no? Of course I did. She rubbed her face. But he's not wrong. I've got debt. More than I thought, and the bank's starting to make noises about payments I can't make. Colt was quiet for a moment, then he said, How much? Enough that I can't cover it on my own. You asking for money? Alara's pride flared. No, I'm asking if you've got work that needs doing. I'll work it off. Colt shook his head. Don't need labor. Then what do you need? He looked at her, his eyes steady. You want help? I'll help. No strings, no debt. We're married on paper. Might as well act like it means something. Alara bristled. That's not what we agreed. I know, but things change. Not for me, they don't. Colt stood, brushing off his pants. Suit yourself. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. He went back to chopping wood, and Alara sat there, caught between anger and something else she couldn't name. She rode home in the dark, and the whole way back she couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. Things change. Maybe. But she wasn't ready to admit that yet. She didn't go back to Colt's place for 2 weeks, and in that time, everything that could go wrong did. The pump broke on the north well. The fence line along the eastern pasture came down in a windstorm, and half her cattle wandered onto the neighbor's land before she could round them up. Then the roof started leaking, not a lot, just enough to be a constant reminder that the house was falling apart in slow motion, one shingle at a time. Alara fixed what she could, the rest she ignored. She was in town picking up nails and tar paper when she ran into Tom Grady again. He was leaning against the post outside the general store, whittling a piece of wood into something that might have been a horse or might have been a dog. Hard to tell. "Mrs. Riker," he said, grinning, "how's married life treating you?" "Fine. Haven't seen your husband around much." "He's busy," Tom laughed. "I bet he is. Must be real busy, seeing as how nobody's seen him in town since the wedding." Alara loaded her supplies onto her horse and didn't answer. "You know," Tom said, still whittling, "people are starting to wonder if you two are actually married or if you just signed some papers to get the bank off your back." Alara stopped. She turned and looked at him. "You got something to say, Tom?" He shrugged. "Just making conversation." "Then make it somewhere else." She mounted up and rode out before he could say another word. But his voice followed her anyway, echoing in her head long after she left town. People were talking. Of course they were. In a place like Ridge Hollow, gossip was currency, and a marriage like hers, sudden, strange, involving a man nobody knew, was the kind of story that got passed around until it didn't resemble the truth anymore. She didn't care. Or at least, she told herself she didn't. But the doubt crept in anyway, small and insistent. What if the bank decided the marriage wasn't legitimate? What if they called it a sham and took the ranch anyway? By the time she got home, her hands were shaking. She needed to make this look real, which meant she needed Colt. Utarjas. This time, she didn't wait for evening. She rode out to his place mid-morning when the heat was already building and the air tasted like dust. Colt was working on his roof, had a ladder propped against the side of the cabin, and was hammering shingles into place with steady, deliberate strikes. He saw her coming and climbed down. "You all right?" he asked, wiping sweat from his face. "No." He waited. Alara dismounted and tied her horse to the post. "People are talking about us, about the marriage. Let them talk. It's not that simple. If the bank thinks this is a sham, they'll use it as an excuse to foreclose." Colt considered that. "What do you want me to do?" "Come into town with me. Be seen. Make it look like we're actually together." He frowned. "You said no interference." "I know what I said, but things are different now." Colt leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed. "You asking me to pretend?" "I'm asking you to show up, that's all. We don't have to hold hands or whatever it is married people do. Just be there." He studied her for a long moment, then he nodded. "All right. All right? You need me in town, I'll be in town." Alara felt something loosen in her chest. Relief, maybe, or just exhaustion. "Thank you." Colt picked up his hammer. "When?" "Saturday. There's a town gathering at the church. Picnic, auction, that sort of thing. Half the county will be there. I don't do crowds. Neither do I. But we're doing this anyway." He didn't argue, just nodded again and went back to work on the roof. Alara rode home feeling like she'd just made a second deal with Colt Riker, and this one felt a lot more dangerous than the first. Saturday came with clear skies and a breeze that almost made the heat bearable. Alara put on a dress she hadn't worn in years, pale green, with lace at the collar that itched like hell. She braided her hair and pinned it up, then stared at herself in the mirror and wondered who she was trying to fool. Colt showed up at her place just before noon, riding the same bay gelding. He'd cleaned up again, shaved, combed his hair, wore a shirt that looked almost new. He didn't smile when he saw her, but his eyes softened just a little. "You look nice." Alara blinked. "What?" "The dress, it's nice." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just climbed onto her horse and started riding. They rode into town together, side by side, and Alara could feel people watching. Heads turned, conversations stopped. By the time they reached the church, it felt like the whole town had gone silent just to stare at them. Tom Grady was the first to approach. He grinned like he'd just won a bet. "Well, well, the happy couple." Colt's expression didn't change. "Tom. Didn't think you'd show, Riker. You're not exactly the social type." "I'm here." "So you are." Tom looked between them. "You two planning to stick around for the auction?" "Maybe," Alara said. "Good. Folks have been curious." "I'm sure they have." Tom laughed and wandered off, and Alara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Colt leaned closer, his voice low. "You all right?" "Fine." "You don't look fine." "Well, I am." He didn't push, just stayed close as they walked toward the picnic tables set up in the churchyard. There were pies and bread and roasted chicken laid out on checkered cloths. Kids ran around chasing each other. Women clustered in groups, talking in low voices. Men stood near the barn, drinking from tin cups and pretending not to watch. Alara felt like she was on display, like she was a specimen under glass, something to be examined and judged. Colt must have sensed it because he put a hand on the small of her back, just briefly, just enough to ground her, and then let go. It shouldn't have mattered. It was just a touch, but it steadied her anyway. They found a spot near the edge of the crowd and stood there, not quite part of things, but not separate either. People came by to say hello, some genuine, some clearly fishing for information. Alara answered their questions with as few words as possible. Colt said even less. And then Victor Hale arrived. He came in a carriage, which was absurd for a town gathering, but that was Hale, always making an entrance. He stepped down, adjusted his coat, and scanned the crowd until his eyes landed on Alara. He smiled. Alara's stomach dropped. Hale walked over, slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world. Mrs. Riker, Mr. Riker, what a pleasant surprise. Colt's posture shifted, just slightly, but Alara noticed. He looked at Hale the way you'd look at a snake. Hale, Colt said, I didn't expect to see you here, Riker. You're not usually one for community events. Things change. Hale's smile widened. Indeed they do. He turned to Alara. I trust you've given my offer some thought. I told you, I'm not selling. Ah, yes, but that was before. Now you've got a partner. He looked at Colt. Perhaps he has a different perspective. Colt's voice was flat. She said no. Of course, but business is business, and sentiment doesn't keep the lights on. Hale pulled out a card and handed it to Alara. When you're ready to have a serious conversation, you know where to find me. He tipped his hat and walked away, already greeting someone else like nothing had happened. Alara stared at the card in her hand. Then she crumpled it and shoved it in her pocket. I hate that man, she muttered. Colt didn't say anything, just stood there, watching Hale disappear into the crowd. The auction started an hour later. It was the usual fare: quilts, preserves, tools, a couple of horses. People bid with the kind of casual competitiveness that came from knowing their neighbors too well. Alara didn't plan on bidding on anything. She was just there to be seen. But then they brought out a saddle. It was beautiful. Hand-tooled leather, brass fittings, the kind of craftsmanship you didn't see much anymore. Alara recognized it immediately. It had belonged to her father. He'd commissioned it years ago, back when the ranch was doing well, and he'd been so proud of it he'd barely used it. She'd sold it last year to pay off a debt. Now it was here, being auctioned off like it had never meant anything. The bidding started at $20. It climbed quickly. 30, 40, 50. Alara watched, her chest tight, her hands clenched. She shouldn't care. It was just a saddle. But it wasn't. It was her father's. And seeing it up there, being bought by someone who didn't know him, didn't know what it meant. It felt like losing him all over again. 60, someone called. Alara's throat burned, and then Colt's voice cut through the noise. 100. The crowd went quiet. The auctioneer blinked. $100. Do I hear 110? Silence. Sold to Mr. Riker. Colt walked up, paid in cash, and took the saddle without a word. He brought it back to where Alara stood, set it down at her feet, and looked at her. It's yours. Alara stared at him. Why would you? Because it's yours. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to process the fact that this man, this stranger she'd married out of necessity, had just spent $100 on something that meant nothing to him and everything to her. I'll pay you back, she said finally. Don't worry about it. Colt, I said don't worry about it. He walked off before she could argue, leaving her standing there with her father's saddle and a feeling she couldn't quite name. They didn't talk much on the ride home. Alara's mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Colt rode beside her, quiet as always, like he hadn't just done something that shifted the entire landscape between them. When they reached the fork in the road, one path leading to her ranch, the other to his, Colt pulled up. You need anything else? He asked. Alara looked at him, really looked at him. Why did you do that? Buy the saddle. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because you looked like you needed it. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. He turned his horse and started down the path to his place. But Alara called after him. Colt. He stopped. Thank you. He nodded, just once, and then he was gone. Alara rode the rest of the way home with the saddle slung across her lap, and for the first time since her father died, she didn't feel quite so alone. The next few weeks passed in a strange sort of rhythm. Colt started showing up at her place more often, not every day, but enough that it became normal. He'd ride over in the morning, help with whatever needed doing, and then head back to his place before dark. He didn't talk much, didn't ask questions, just worked. At first, Alara didn't know what to make of it. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't agreed to it. But every time she tried to tell him he didn't have to keep coming, he'd just shrug and say, I'm here anyway. So she stopped arguing. They fixed the fence line together, repaired the barn door that had been hanging crooked for months, cleared brush from the irrigation ditches. It was hard work, the kind that left them both exhausted and covered in dirt, but it got done faster with two people. And somewhere in the middle of all that work, things started to shift. It was small at first, little moments that didn't mean much on their own, but added up to something. Like the time Alara was trying to lift a beam into place, and Colt just stepped in without asking, taking the weight so she could secure it. Or the time he brought coffee in a thermos because he knew she always forgot to eat breakfast. Or the time she noticed he'd reshoed one of her horses without mentioning it. She didn't thank him for every little thing. That would have been weird, but she noticed. And he noticed her too. Like the way she always checked the animals before herself, even when she was bone-tired. Or the way she'd bite her lip when she was concentrating. Or the way she'd get this look on her face, stubborn and determined and a little bit lost, whenever something went wrong. They didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it, but it was there, humming under the surface like a current. One evening, after they'd spent the whole day clearing rocks from the south pasture, they sat on her porch with glasses of water and watched the sun set. You ever think about leaving? Alara asked. Colt looked at her. Leaving where? Here. Ridge Hollow. All of it. He was quiet for a moment. Sometimes. Why don't you? Same reason you don't. And what's that? Colt stared at the horizon. Because leaving doesn't fix anything, just moves the problem somewhere else. Alara didn't respond. She just sat there, thinking about all the times she'd wanted to run. From the ranch, from the debt, from the weight of her father's expectations. But she never had, because Colt was right. Running didn't fix anything. You ever regret it? She asked. Saying yes to this? Colt glanced at her. Do you? I asked first. He smiled, just barely, just enough to count. No, I don't regret it. Why not? Because it got me here. Alara didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and looked away, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. But of course, nothing good lasts long in a place like Ridge Hollow. Victor Hale came back. This time, he didn't come to her ranch. He went straight to the bank. And 3 days later, Alara got a letter. She opened it in the kitchen, alone, and read it twice before the words sank in. The bank was calling in her loan, all of it. She had 60 days to pay in full, or they'd foreclose. Alara sat down hard in the nearest chair, the letter still in her hand. This wasn't random. This was Hale. He'd pulled strings, called in favors, done whatever it took to back her into a corner. She couldn't pay the loan. Not in 60 days, not in 6 months. She'd need a miracle, and those were in short supply. For the first time since her father died, Alara felt the real weight of it, the impossibility of keeping this place, of holding on to something that was already slipping through her fingers. She sat there for a long time, staring at the letter, feeling the walls close in. And then she heard hoofbeats. She looked up. Through the window, she saw Colt riding toward the house. He dismounted, tied his horse, and walked up to the porch. Alara met him at the door. She didn't say anything, just handed him the letter. Colt read it, his jaw tightening. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back. Hale, he said. It wasn't a question. Has to be. Colt looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something sharp and dangerous. We're not letting him take this place. We don't have a choice. There's always a choice. Alara laughed, bitter and tired. Really? What choice? I can't pay the loan. Even if I sold everything I own, it wouldn't be enough. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How much do you need? More than I can get. How much, Alara? She told him. The full amount. Every brutal, impossible dollar. Colt didn't flinch. I've got it. Alara stared at him. What? I've got the money. I'll pay it. You... She shook her head. No, absolutely not. Why not? Because that's not the deal. You don't owe me anything. Maybe I do. Colt, listen to me. He stepped closer, his voice steady. You married me so you could keep this place. I signed the papers, but if you lose the ranch anyway, then what was the point? Let me do this. Alara's throat tightened. I can't take your money. It's not about taking. It's about keeping what's yours. And what do you get out of it? Colt looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Maybe I just want to see you win. Alara felt something crack open inside her, something she'd been holding shut for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She wanted to argue, wanted to push him away, but she was so tired of fighting alone. All right, she said quietly. All right. Colt nodded. We'll go to the bank tomorrow. Together. And for the first time in weeks, Alara felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't going to lose everything after all. They went to the bank the next morning. Alara wore her best dress. Colt wore the same clothes he'd worn to the wedding. They walked in together, and the clerk's eyes widened when she saw them. Mrs. Riker, Mr. Riker, how can I help you? We're here to pay off a loan, Alara said. The clerk blinked. The full amount? Yes. She disappeared into the back and returned with Mr. Pettigrew, who looked even more uncomfortable than usual. Mrs. Riker, he said, I wasn't expecting you. I'm sure you weren't. Pettigrew glanced at Colt, then back at Alara. The amount due is substantial. Are you certain? We're certain, Colt said. He pulled out a bank draft and set it on the counter. This should cover it. Pettigrew picked it up, examined it, and then looked at Colt like he'd just grown a second head. This is quite a sum. Is it enough? Yes, more than enough. Then we're done here. Pettigrew stammered something about paperwork, but Alara barely heard him. She just stood there, watching as he processed the payment, stamped the documents, and handed her a receipt. The loan is paid in full, he said. The ranch is clear. Alara took the receipt. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She just nodded and walked out. Colt followed. They stood on the street outside the bank, the sun beating down, and Alara realized she was holding her breath. It's done, Colt said. It's done. She should have felt relief. She should have felt victorious. But all she felt was a strange, overwhelming gratitude that she didn't know how to express. I'll pay you back, she said. Every cent. I don't know how long it'll take, but I will. Colt shook his head. Don't worry about it. I'm going to worry about it. He smiled, just a little. Then worry. But I'm not asking for it back. Alara looked at him, this man she'd married out of desperation, and realized she didn't know him at all. But she wanted to. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the day over and over. The bank. The payment. The way Colt had stood beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't understand him, didn't understand why he'd done it, and the not knowing itched at her like a splinter she couldn't dig out. Finally, she got up, pulled on a shawl, and walked outside. The night was cool and clear. Stars scattered across the sky like someone had spilled salt. Alara sat on the porch steps and let the silence settle over her. She didn't hear Colt approach until he was already there. She looked up, startled. What are you doing here? Saw your light on. Thought I'd check. I'm fine. You don't look fine. Alara laughed, short and tired. Does anyone ever actually look fine? Colt sat down beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. What's keeping you up? Everything. Nothing. I don't know. She pulled the shawl tighter. I keep thinking about what you did today, and I can't figure out why. Why what? Why you helped me? Why you keep helping me? We're not. She paused, searching for the right words. This was supposed to be simple, a transaction. But you're acting like it's something else. Colt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, maybe it is something else. Alara looked at him. What does that mean? I don't know, but I know I don't regret any of it. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Alara wanted to ask more, wanted to push until he gave her a real answer, but she was afraid of what he might say. Afraid that once they started talking about what this was, they wouldn't be able to stop. So instead, she just sat there, side by side with him, watching the stars and wondering when everything had gotten so complicated. Thank you, she said finally. For today. For all of it. Colt nodded. You don't have to keep thanking me. I know, but I'm going to anyway. He smiled at that, really smiled, not just the hint of one, and Alara felt something shift between them, quiet and inevitable. They sat there until the cold drove them inside, and when Colt finally rode home, Alara stood on the porch and watched him go, her heart doing something it hadn't done in a long time. It was hope, fragile and uncertain, but there. And for now, that was enough. The hope lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, Victor Hale made his next move. Alara was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when she heard horses coming up the drive. She straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans, and walked outside. 3 men sat on horseback. She recognized 2 of them, hired hands who worked for Hale. The third was a stranger, dressed in a suit that looked out of place against the dust and sage. The stranger dismounted first. Mrs. Riker? That's me. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and held it out. I'm here on behalf of the county land office. There's been a dispute filed regarding your eastern boundary line. Alara took the paper, her stomach sinking. What kind of dispute? Mr. Victor Hale claims that the fence line marking your property is incorrect. According to a survey he commissioned, approximately 30 acres of what you consider your land actually falls within his claim. Alara felt the ground tilt under her feet. 30 acres. That was nearly a sixth of her property, including the best grazing land she had. That's impossible. My father had the property surveyed when he bought it. I'm sure he did, but Mr. Hale has documentation suggesting otherwise. You'll need to appear at a hearing next month to settle the matter. He tipped his hat. Good day, ma'am. The 3 men rode off, leaving Alara standing there with the document in her hand and rage burning through her veins. She knew what this was. Hale hadn't gotten the ranch through the bank, so now he was going to carve it up piece by piece, using legal maneuvers she couldn't afford to fight. She read through the document twice, trying to make sense of the legal language, and then she saddled her horse and rode straight to Colt's place. He was splitting logs when she arrived, his shirt soaked through with sweat. He took one look at her face and set down the axe. What happened? Alara handed him the paper. Hale's claiming my land, says the boundary line is wrong. Colt read through it, his jaw tightening with every line. This is horseshit. I know that, you know that. But he's got lawyers and surveyors and paperwork, and I've got nothing. Your father's survey is 30 years old. Hale's arguing that it was never properly filed with the county, and maybe he's right. I don't know. My father didn't exactly keep meticulous records. Colt folded the paper and handed it back. So we get a new survey. With what money? You already paid off the loan. I can't ask you for more. You're not asking. I'm offering. Alara shook her head. No, this is too much. I can't keep taking from you. Then what's your plan? She didn't have one. That was the problem. She'd been so focused on keeping the ranch that she hadn't thought about what came next. Hadn't considered that men like Hale didn't stop just because you won one round. I don't know, she said finally, but I'll figure it out. Colt looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, You're not doing this alone. Colt? I mean it. We're in this together now, whether you like it or not. Alara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need help. But the truth was, she did. And she was tired of pretending otherwise. All right, she said quietly. Together. Colt nodded. First thing we do is get that survey, find out what the actual boundary line is. Then we figure out how to fight Hale. And if we can't, we will. He said it with such certainty that Alara almost believed him. Okay, They hired a surveyor out of Crestfield, 2 towns over. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had a reputation for being thorough and honest, two qualities that were in short supply in Ridge Hollow. Webb arrived 3 days later with his equipment and a young assistant who barely looked old enough to shave. They spent 2 full days walking the property, taking measurements, marking points, and consulting old maps that looked like they'd been drawn by someone with a shaky hand and poor eyesight. Alara and Colt followed them for most of it, watching in silence as Webb worked. It was slow, tedious work, and every hour that passed felt like another layer of anxiety settling over Alara's shoulders. On the 3rd day, Webb called them over to the eastern fence line. "Here's the thing," he said, pointing to a cluster of markers he'd set in the ground. "Your father's original survey was accurate. The boundary line is exactly where your fence is now." Alara felt a rush of relief so strong it made her dizzy. "So Hale's claim is false?" "Not exactly." Webb pulled out a map and spread it on the ground. "The problem is that Hale's land and your land share a boundary that was never formally registered with the county. Your father had a survey done, but he never filed the final plat, which means, technically, the boundary is still in dispute." "But you just said the survey was accurate." "It is, but without the proper paperwork, Hale can argue that it's not legally binding. And if he's got a survey that says otherwise, even if it's wrong, the county's going to have to take it seriously." Colt's voice was low and dangerous. "So what do we do?" "You file this survey with the county, get it on record. That'll establish your claim. But you need to do it before the hearing, or Hale's survey will be the only one on file." "How long will that take?" "A week, maybe 2, depending on how backed up the land office is." Alara's heart sank. The hearing was in 3 weeks. If the paperwork didn't go through in time, Hale would win by default. "Thank you," she said. "We'll take care of it." Webb packed up his equipment, and Alara paid him with money she didn't really have. When he left, she and Colt stood at the fence line, staring out at the land that might not be hers much longer. "We're running out of time," Alara said. "Then we don't waste any." "What if the paperwork doesn't go through?" Colt looked at her. "It will." "You don't know that." "No. But I know you don't give up, and neither do I." Alara wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to that certainty like it was a lifeline. But the fear was there, gnawing at her, whispering that maybe this time it wouldn't be enough. They filed the survey the next day. The county land office was a cramped, dusty building that smelled like mildew and old ink. The clerk behind the desk was a man in his 60s with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He took the documents, glanced at them, and set them in a pile with a dozen others. "How long until it's processed?" Alara asked. "Hard to say. We're backed up. Could be a week. Could be longer. We have a hearing in 3 weeks. We need this on file before then." The clerk looked at her over his spectacles. "I understand, ma'am, but there's a process. I can't expedite it just because you've got a deadline." "This isn't just a deadline. This is my land." "I'm sorry. I'll do my best, but I can't make any promises." Alara wanted to scream, wanted to grab the papers and shake them in his face until he understood how much this mattered. But she didn't. She just nodded stiffly and walked out. Colt followed. "We'll check back in a few days." "What if it's not enough time?" "Then we figure out another way." "There is no other way." Colt stopped walking and turned to face her. "Listen to me. Hale wants you to panic, wants you to think you're out of options. That's how he wins, but you're not out of options. Not yet." Alara stared at him. "How are you so calm about this?" "I'm not calm, I'm just focused." "On what?" "On making sure you don't lose." Alara felt something tighten in her chest, something that might have been gratitude or might have been something else entirely. She didn't know how to name it, so she just nodded and kept walking. A week passed with no word from the land office. Alara tried to keep busy. She threw herself into work, fixing things that didn't need fixing, reorganizing the barn, anything to keep her mind off the hearing. Colt showed up every day, same as before, and they worked side by side in a silence that had become almost comfortable. But the tension was there, simmering under the surface. One evening, after they'd spent the day mending fence posts, they sat on her porch with cups of coffee that had gone cold. "You ever think about what you'd do if you lost this place?" Colt asked. Alara looked at him sharply. Why would you ask that? Not saying you will, just wondering. I don't think about it, because I'm not going to lose. But if you did, I won't. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I grew up on a farm, back east. My father lost it when I was 16. Bank took it, just like they're trying to take yours. And for years I thought that was the worst thing that could happen, losing the land, but it wasn't. Alara turned to look at him. What was? Watching my father give up. He didn't fight, didn't try to save it, just let it go. And after that he wasn't the same. It broke something in him. Colt stared out at the horizon. I swore I'd never let that happen to me, that if I ever had something worth keeping, I'd fight for it, no matter what. Alara's throat felt tight. Is that why you're helping me? Maybe, or maybe I just don't want to see you break the way he did. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just sat there, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket. I'm not going to break, she said finally. I know. And I'm not giving up. I know that too. They sat in silence after that, and for the first time Alara felt like maybe they understood each other. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Bosse. The word came back from the land office 2 days before the hearing. The survey had been filed. It was official. Alara's boundary line was on record. She stood in the clerk's office holding the stamped document and felt something like relief wash over her. Not complete, not final, but close. Thank you, she said. The clerk nodded. Good luck at the hearing. She and Colt walked out into the sunlight, and Alara took a deep breath. We did it, she said. We did. Now we just have to convince the county board. We will. Alara looked at him. You keep saying that. Because I mean it. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to that certainty, but doubt still lingered, small and insistent. What if they side with Hale anyway? Then we appeal, and if that doesn't work, we find another way. There's not always another way. Colt stopped walking and turned to face her. There is if you don't give up. Alara stared at him, this man who'd become something more than a stranger, something more than a business arrangement. She didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, she'd started to rely on him, started to trust him, and that scared her more than losing the land ever could. The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a grim brick building that looked like it had been designed to crush hope. Alara wore her best dress again, the same one she'd worn to the wedding, the same one she'd worn to the bank. It felt like armor now, something to hide behind. Colt wore a clean shirt and a jacket he must have borrowed, because it didn't quite fit. He stood beside her as they walked into the hearing room, and his presence was the only thing keeping her from turning around and walking out. Victor Hale was already there, sitting at a table with 2 men in expensive suits. He looked up when Alara entered, and he smiled. It made her want to punch him. The county board consisted of 3 men, 2 ranchers and a lawyer, who sat behind a long table at the front of the room. They looked bored before the hearing even started. The lawyer, a man named Aldridge, called the room to order. We're here to settle a boundary dispute between Mrs. Alara Riker and Mr. Victor Hale. Mr. Hale, you may present your case. Hale stood, smooth and confident. Thank you, Mr. Aldridge. As outlined in the documents I've submitted, a recent survey of my property revealed that the boundary line between my land and Mrs. Riker's has been incorrectly marked. The fence currently in place encroaches on land that rightfully belongs to me, specifically 30 acres of grazing land. One of Hale's lawyers stood and handed out copies of the survey. The board members examined them, nodding occasionally. Aldridge looked at Alara. Mrs. Riker, do you have a response? Alara stood, her hands shaking. Yes, I've had my property surveyed as well, and the results show that the boundary line is exactly where it's always been. My father's original survey was accurate, and I've filed the new survey with the county land office to make it official. She handed over the documents, Webb's survey, the filed plat, everything they had. Aldridge reviewed them, frowning slightly. And when was this survey filed? 8 days ago. One of the ranchers on the board leaned forward. That's awfully convenient timing, Mrs. Riker. I filed it as soon as I was made aware of Mr. Hale's claim. Hale's lawyer stood. With all due respect, Mrs. Riker's survey was filed only after Mr. Hale's dispute was announced. This suggests it was done in response, rather than as a legitimate effort to establish boundaries. Alara's temper flared. That's ridiculous. I've owned this land for— Mrs. Riker, Aldridge interrupted. Please keep your composure. Colt stood. May I speak? Aldridge looked at him. And you are? Colt Riker, her husband. Very well. What do you have to add? Colt's voice was calm, steady. Mr. Hale's claim relies on the assumption that there was never a proper survey filed. But the fact is, Mrs. Riker's father had the land surveyed 30 years ago. That survey established the boundary line. We've simply reconfirmed it and filed the updated paperwork. There's nothing convenient about it. It's due diligence. One of the board members nodded. Another looked skeptical. Hale stood again. If I may, the issue isn't whether a survey was done. It's whether the original survey was accurate. My survey suggests it was not. Aldridge sighed. This is going to require further review. We'll need to compare both surveys in detail before making a determination. Alara's heart sank. How long will that take? At least 2 weeks, possibly longer. But that's our decision, Mrs. Riker. This hearing is adjourned. The board members stood and filed out, leaving Alara standing there, helpless and furious. Hale walked past her on his way out, and he leaned in just close enough to whisper, You can't win this, Alara. You know that. Colt stepped between them before Alara could respond. Keep walking, Hale. Hale smiled and walked away. Alara stood there, shaking with rage. This isn't over. No, Colt said. It's not. Bucket. They rode home in silence. Alara didn't trust herself to speak. She was afraid that if she started, she wouldn't be able to stop, that all the anger and fear and exhaustion would come pouring out, and she wouldn't be able to put it back. When they reached her ranch, Colt dismounted and walked her to the porch. You did good in there, he said. Alara laughed bitterly. I didn't do anything. They're still reviewing. Hale's still circling. Nothing's changed. You stood your ground. That's something. It doesn't feel like enough. Colt looked at her, and there was something in his eyes, something fierce and protective. It's going to be. Alara wanted to believe him, but the doubt was there, louder than ever. I'm tired, Colt. I'm so tired of fighting. I know. What if I can't win? Colt stepped closer, close enough that she could see the scar on his jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes. Then we lose. But we lose together. Alara felt tears sting her eyes, and she hated herself for it. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't break. But Colt didn't look at her like she was weak. He just stood there, steady and solid, and that was enough. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For not leaving. Colt's expression softened. I'm not going anywhere. And in that moment, standing on her porch with the weight of the world pressing down on her, Alara believed him. 2 days later, the fire started. Alara was in the house going over paperwork she'd read 100 times already when she smelled smoke. She looked up, confused. It was late afternoon, and she hadn't lit the stove. She walked to the window and looked out. Smoke was rising from the south pasture, thick and black. Her heart stopped. She ran outside, already yelling, Fire! Fire! The wind was blowing hard from the south, pushing the flames toward the barn. Alara ran for the well, grabbed a bucket, and started hauling water. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. The fire was moving fast, eating through dry grass like it was kindling. She heard hoofbeats and turned to see Colt riding hard toward her. He jumped off his horse before it had even stopped. How bad? He shouted. Bad. It's heading for the barn. Colt looked at the flames, then at the barn. His face went hard. We need to move the animals. They ran together, throwing open the barn doors, leading the horses out one by one. The smoke was thick now, burning Alara's lungs with every breath. The animals were panicking, fighting against the lid ropes, but Alara held on, dragging them to safety. Colt worked beside her, moving faster than she'd ever seen him move. They got the horses out. Then the cattle in the nearby pen, but the fire kept coming. We need to make a fire break, Colt said. Cut the grass between here and the barn. They grabbed tools, shovels, rakes, anything they could use, and started tearing up the ground, creating a barrier the fire couldn't cross. Alara's hands blistered, her arms screamed, but she didn't stop. Colt worked beside her, silent and focused, and together they carved a line in the earth. The flames hit the fire break and hesitated, flickering and snapping, trying to find a way through. And then the wind shifted. The fire turned, moving away from the barn, back toward the empty pasture. Alara watched it go, her chest heaving, her whole body shaking. They'd done it. They'd stopped it. She collapsed onto the ground, too exhausted to stand. Colt dropped down beside her, covered in soot and sweat, and for a moment they just sat there, breathing. "You all right?" he asked. Alara nodded, even though she wasn't sure it was true. "You?" "Yeah." They sat in silence, watching the smoke rise into the sky, and Alara realized something. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Colt had been there, had shown up, had fought beside her without hesitation. And somewhere in the middle of the fire and the fear, every wall she'd built between them had burned away. She looked at him, this man who'd become her partner in more ways than one, and she felt something shift, something she couldn't take back. "Colt," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I don't know what this is, between us, but it's not just a deal anymore." Colt stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "No, it's not." Alara's heart pounded in her chest. "So what is it?" Colt reached out and took her hand, his grip steady and sure. "I don't know, but I'm not walking away from it." Alara looked down at their joined hands, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel afraid. She felt something else, something that might have been trust, or maybe something more. They stayed on the ground until the sun started to dip below the hills, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of orange and red that looked too much like the fire they'd just fought. Alara finally let go of Colt's hand and pushed herself to her feet. Her legs shook, but she stayed upright, barely. "We should check the pasture," she said. "Make sure it's really out." Colt stood beside her. "I'll do it. You should rest." "I'm fine." "Alara, I said I'm fine." She wasn't. Every part of her ached. Her hands were blistered and bleeding. Her lungs burned with every breath. But she'd be damned if she was going to sit down while there was still work to do. Colt looked at her like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just nodded and walked with her toward the burned section of pasture. The grass was blackened and smoking, but the flames were gone. They'd caught it just in time. Another 10 minutes and the barn would have gone up. Another hour and the whole ranch might have burned. Alara stood at the edge of the scorched earth and felt something inside her crack open. She'd come so close to losing everything. Again. "How did it start?" she asked. Colt crouched down, examining the ground. He picked up something, a piece of glass, curved and charred. He held it up to the light. "Bottle," he said. "Could have been the sun hitting it wrong. Glass focuses light, starts a fire." Alara frowned. "There shouldn't be bottles out here." "Maybe someone left it, kids maybe, or someone put it there." Colt's jaw tightened. "You think Hale did this?" "I don't know, but it's one hell of a coincidence, don't you think? Right after the hearing?" Colt stood, pocketing the glass. "If he did, there's no way to prove it." "I know." Alara kicked at the blackened grass. "But I know it was him. I can feel it." Colt didn't argue. He just stood there, looking out at the damage, and Alara could see the anger in the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. "What do we do?" she asked. "We keep going, same as before." "And if he tries again?" "Then we stop him." Alara looked at him. "How?" Colt met her eyes, and there was something dangerous in his expression. "However we have to." Boutique. They walked back to the house together, and Alara realized how late it had gotten. The sun was almost gone, and the temperature was starting to drop. "You should stay," she said. "It's too dark to ride back." Colt hesitated. "You sure?" "Yeah. I've got a spare room. It's nothing fancy, but it's got a bed." "All right." They went inside, and Alara lit the lamps while Colt washed the soot off his face and hands in the basin. She made coffee, strong and bitter, the way her father used to make it, and they sat at the kitchen table, not talking, just existing in the same space. It should have been awkward. They'd barely spent time together inside a house. And now here they were, sitting across from each other like it was the most natural thing in the world. But it didn't feel awkward. It felt right. "Thank you," Alara said finally. For today. For showing up. Colt looked at her. You don't have to keep thanking me. I know, but I'm going to anyway. He smiled at that. Just a little, just enough. Then you're welcome. They finished their coffee in silence, and when Alara stood to show him to the spare room, Colt caught her wrist. Alara. She looked down at him. I meant what I said earlier, about not walking away. Alara's throat tightened. I know. Do you? She pulled her hand free, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't trust herself not to do something stupid. I'm trying to. Colt stood, and suddenly he was close. Too close. Not close enough. Trying's not the same as believing. I don't... Alara stopped, frustrated. I don't know how to do this. Whatever this is. I've spent so long keeping people at a distance, I don't know how to let someone in. Then don't. Not all at once. Just... He paused, searching for the right words. Just don't push me away. Alara looked at him, this man who'd become something she hadn't known she needed, and she felt the walls she'd built start to crumble. I'm scared, she whispered. Of what? Of needing you. Colt's expression softened. Why? Because everyone I've ever needed has left. My mother, my father, and I... Her voice broke. I can't do that again. I can't lose someone else. Colt reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. You're not going to lose me. You don't know that. I do, because I'm choosing to stay. Every day I'm choosing to stay. Alara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and for the first time in years she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone. But she didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day over and over. The fire, the fight. The way Colt had looked at her when he said he wasn't walking away. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he meant it, but the fear was still there, gnawing at her, whispering that this was temporary, that eventually he'd see her for what she was, stubborn, difficult, broken, and he'd leave, just like everyone else. Around midnight, she heard footsteps in the hall. She sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the rifle she kept by the bed. But then she heard Colt's voice, low and steady. It's just me. Alara set the rifle down and opened the door. Colt stood in the hallway, fully dressed, his face shadowed in the lamplight. Couldn't sleep? She asked. No. Me neither. They stood there for a moment, neither of them knowing what to say. Then Colt gestured toward the front door. Want to sit outside for a bit? Alara nodded and followed him out to the porch. They sat on the steps, just like they had so many times before, and stared out at the dark expanse of the ranch. The air was cool and still, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. You ever think about leaving all this behind? Alara asked. Starting over somewhere new? Colt was quiet for a moment. Sometimes. But then I remember there's nothing out there I want more than what's here. What's here? He looked at her. You. Alara's breath caught. Colt. I'm not good with words, he said. Never have been. But I need you to know this isn't just about the ranch for me. It's about you. Alara felt tears sting her eyes again, and she hated it. Hated that she couldn't keep herself together. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, just don't shut me out. Alara looked at him, and in that moment she made a choice. Not because she wasn't scared, but because she was tired of letting fear make her decisions. I won't, she said. I promise. Colt nodded, and the tension between them eased just a little. They sat there until the sky started to lighten, and when they finally went back inside, Alara felt like something fundamental had shifted, like they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and she was glad they had. Word about the fire spread fast. By the next afternoon, half the town knew, and by evening, people started showing up to help. Neighbors Alara barely knew brought tools and supplies. A few of the men helped clear the burned grass. A couple of women brought food, casseroles and bread and pies that Alara didn't have the heart to turn down. Tom Grady showed up too, looking uncharacteristically serious. Heard about the fire, he said. Thought I'd check in, make sure you're all right. I'm fine, Alara said. We got it under control. Tom glanced at Colt, who was helping one of the neighbors repair a section of fence. Heard your husband was here when it started. Lucky timing, Alara bristled. What are you implying? Tom held up his hands. Nothing, just saying it's lucky he was around. He lives 4 miles away. He saw the smoke and came to help. That's what people do. Right. Of course. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Look, Alara, I'm not trying to start trouble. There's been talk. There's always talk. Not like this. People are saying Hale might have had something to do with the fire. Alara's heart skipped. What people? Can't say, but if there's any truth to it, you need to be careful. Hale's got a lot of influence in this town. If he wanted to make your life difficult, he could. He already is. Tom nodded. Just watch your back, all right? Both of you. He tipped his hat and walked off, leaving Alara standing there with a cold knot in her stomach. Colt came over a few minutes later, wiping sweat from his forehead. What did Tom want? To warn us. Said people are talking about Hale being behind the fire. Colt's expression darkened. You think he was? I don't know, but I wouldn't put it past him. If he was, we need proof. And how do we get that? Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, we start asking questions, find out if anyone saw anything unusual. Tom said Hale has influence. If we start poking around, he'll know. Good. Let him know. Alara looked at him. You want him to know? I want him to understand that we're not backing down. That if he comes at you again, he's coming at both of us. Alara felt a surge of gratitude and something else, something stronger. You're really not going to walk away, are you? I told you I wasn't. I know, but hearing it and believing it are two different things. Colt reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. Then I'll keep saying it until you believe it. Alara squeezed his hand, and for the first time she let herself hope that maybe he was right, that maybe this was real. They spent the next few days asking around town, trying to piece together what had happened the day of the fire. Most people didn't have much to say. A few mentioned seeing a rider near Alara's property earlier that day, but no one could give a clear description. One of the older ranchers said he'd seen someone on the south road, heading away from her place, but he couldn't say for sure who it was. It wasn't much, but it was something. Alara was in the general store picking up supplies when she overheard two women talking near the back. Heard Hale's been hiring more men, ranch hands, supposedly, but they don't look like ranch hands to me. What do they look like? Trouble. Alara's ears perked up. She moved closer, pretending to examine a sack of flour. You think he's planning something? The second woman asked. I don't know. But after what happened with the Vance place, well, the Riker place now, I suppose, I wouldn't be surprised. Alara's hands tightened on the sack. She paid for her supplies and left quickly, her mind racing. If Hale was hiring men, it wasn't for ranch work. It was for something else, something that involved her. She found Colt at the blacksmith's, watching as the smith repaired a broken plow blade. She pulled him aside and told him what she'd heard. Colt's jaw tightened. We need to be ready. For what? Whatever he's planning. And how do we do that? Colt thought for a moment. Then he said, we make sure we're not alone. Keep people around. Stay visible. If Hale's planning something, he's less likely to try it if there are witnesses. You think he'd actually try to hurt us? I don't know, but I'm not taking chances. Alara nodded. All right, so what's the plan? We stick together. You don't go anywhere alone. I'll stay at your place until this is over. Colt, you don't have to... Yes, I do. Alara looked at him, and she saw the determination in his eyes, the protectiveness, and something else, something that made her chest ache. Okay, she said. Okay. That night, Colt moved into the spare room at Alara's place. It should have felt strange having him there all the time. But it didn't. It felt natural, like he'd always been there. They fell into a routine. Colt would wake before dawn and start coffee. Alara would feed the animals. They'd work together during the day, fixing what needed fixing, tending to the land. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and talk, or not talk, depending on the day. It was quiet, simple. And for the first time in a long time, Alara felt like she could breathe. But the peace didn't last. 3 days after Colt moved in, Victor Hale came calling again. Alara was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when she heard horses. She stepped outside and saw Hale riding up the drive, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. They were big, rough-looking, with the kind of faces that suggested they'd spent more time in fights than in honest work. Alara's stomach dropped. Colt came out of the house, rifle in hand. He didn't point it at anyone, but the message was clear. Hale dismounted, smiling like this was a social call. "Mrs. Riker." "Mr. Riker, I hope I'm not interrupting." "What do you want, Hale?" Alara asked. "Just checking in, making sure you're recovering from the fire. Terrible thing, that. You're lucky it didn't spread." "We managed." "I'm sure you did. You're very resourceful." Hale glanced at Colt. "Both of you?" Colt's voice was flat. "State your business or leave." Hale's smile didn't waver. "I'm here to make one final offer. I'll pay you double what your land is worth, clear your debts, give you enough to start fresh somewhere else. All you have to do is sign." "I'm not selling," Alara said. "Are you sure? Because things have been difficult for you lately. The fire, the boundary dispute. It seems like the land is more trouble than it's worth." "That's because you're making it trouble." Hale's smile thinned. "I'm simply trying to conduct business, Mrs. Riker. If you insist on being difficult, well, accidents happen." Colt stepped forward, and his voice was low and dangerous. "Are you threatening her?" "Not at all. I'm simply stating a fact. This is hard country. People get hurt all the time. Fires start, fences collapse, animals go missing. It's a shame, really, but that's the nature of ranch life." Alara felt rage burn through her. "Get off my property." Hale held up his hands. "Of course. I don't mean to overstay my welcome, but the offer stands. Think about it." He climbed back onto his horse and tipped his hat. "Take care, Mrs. Riker, and do be careful. You never know what might happen." He rode off, his men following, and Alara stood there, shaking with fury. "He's going to try something," she said. "I know." "What do we do?" Colt looked at her, and there was steel in his eyes. "We don't let him win." That night, Alara couldn't sleep again. She lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling, and tried to quiet the fear gnawing at her. Hale wasn't going to stop. He'd made that clear. And she didn't know how to fight someone who had money, power, and no conscience. She heard footsteps in the hall again, and this time she didn't wait. She got up and opened the door. Colt stood there, looking as restless as she felt. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "No." "Me neither." They went outside, same as before, and sat on the porch steps. The night was clear and cold, and the stars stretched out above them like something eternal. "I'm scared," Alara said quietly. "I don't know how to beat him." Colt didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You're not supposed to know. You just have to keep going." "What if that's not enough?" "Then we figure out what is." Alara looked at him. "You keep saying we, like this is your fight too." "It is." "Why?" Colt turned to face her, and his expression was serious. "Because you're mine, Alara. Maybe that's not how this started, but that's what it's become. And I don't let people hurt what's mine." Alara's breath caught. "Colt, I know you're scared. I know you don't trust easy, but I need you to hear me. I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. You understand?" Alara felt tears spill over, and she didn't try to stop them. "I'm trying to believe you." "Then keep trying, because I'm not giving up on you." He reached out and pulled her close, and Alara let herself fall into him, burying her face in his chest. She felt his arms wrap around her, strong and steady, and for the first time she let herself lean on someone else. They stayed like that for a long time, and when they finally pulled apart, Alara looked up at him. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "How to let someone in." "You don't have to know, you just have to try." Alara nodded, and then, before she could talk herself out of it, she leaned up and kissed him. It was hesitant at first, uncertain, like she wasn't sure she had the right. But Colt kissed her back, his hand coming up to cup her face, and suddenly it wasn't hesitant anymore. It was real and raw, and everything she'd been afraid to want. When they finally broke apart, Alara was breathless. "I'm still scared," she whispered. "I know," Colt said, "but you don't have to be scared alone." Alara nodded, and for the first time she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found something worth fighting for. Not just the land, but this. Them. The next morning, Alara woke to the sound of voices outside. She got up quickly, pulling on her clothes, and rushed to the window. A group of people, neighbors, friends, people she barely knew, were gathered in her yard talking to Colt. She hurried outside. "What's going on?" One of the ranchers, an older man named Samuel, stepped forward. "We heard what Hale said to you about the threats." "Word travels fast," Alara said. "It does, and we don't like it. Hale's been pushing people around for years, and it's time someone pushed back." Alara blinked. "What are you saying?" "We're saying we've got your back. All of us. If Hale tries something, he's going to have to go through all of us." Alara felt her throat tighten. "You don't have to do that." Samuel shrugged. "Maybe not, but we're going to anyway. You're one of us, Alara, and we take care of our own." Alara looked around at the faces gathered there. People she'd known her whole life. People who'd watched her grow up. People who'd seen her struggle and hadn't turned away. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you." Colt put a hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into him, feeling the weight of the community around her. For the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. She never had been. She'd just been too scared to see it. The crowd stayed most of the morning, helping with repairs, reinforcing fence lines, and making their presence known. It was a statement, not just to Hale, but to the whole county. Alara Riker wasn't alone anymore, and anyone who came after her would have to answer to all of them. By noon, most of the neighbors had headed back to their own places, promising to check in regularly. Samuel was the last to leave. He shook Colt's hand and tipped his hat to Alara. "You need anything, you send word," he said. "Don't matter what time of day." "I will," Alara said. "Thank you, Samuel." He nodded and rode off, leaving Alara and Colt standing in the yard, surrounded by the evidence of a morning's worth of community effort. "That was something," Alara said quietly. Colt looked at her. "You didn't think people cared?" "I didn't think they cared enough to risk Hale's anger." "You underestimate yourself." Alara shook her head. "No, I just forgot that not everyone's like me. Some people still believe in helping each other." Colt put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, letting herself take comfort in the gesture. It still felt new, this closeness, this trust, but it was getting easier every day. "We should eat something," Colt said. "You didn't have breakfast." "Neither did you." "Then we're both idiots." Alara laughed, and it felt good. Felt normal. Like maybe things were going to be okay after all. They went inside, and Alara made eggs and toast while Colt boiled coffee. They ate at the kitchen table, talking about nothing important. The weather, the horses, what needed doing next week. It was mundane and comfortable, and Alara realized this was what she'd been missing her whole life. Not grand gestures or declarations, just this. Simple, steady companionship. "You know," she said, setting down her fork, "I never thought I'd have this." "Have what?" "Someone to eat breakfast with." Colt smiled. "That's a low bar." "Maybe, but it matters." He reached across the table and took her hand. "It does." They finished eating, and Alara was washing the dishes when she heard horses again. Her stomach dropped, thinking it was Hale, but when she looked out the window, she saw Tom Grady riding up alone. Colt must have seen her expression change. "What is it?" "Tom's here." They went outside together. Tom dismounted, looking more serious than Alara had ever seen him. "Tom," she said, "what's wrong?" "Need to talk to you both. Inside, preferably." They led him into the house, and Tom took off his hat, turning it in his hands like he didn't know where to start. "Just say it," Alara said. Tom took a breath. "There's been an incident. One of Hale's men got drunk last night at the saloon. Started bragging about how Hale was going to run you off your land one way or another. Said the fire was just the beginning." Alara's blood ran cold. "He admitted Hale was behind the fire?" "Not directly, but he implied it. Said Hale had plans. Big plans." "What kind of plans?" Colt asked, his voice dangerously calm. Tom shook his head. "Bar talk isn't evidence, and he didn't confess to anything specific. Best I can do is keep an eye on him, see if he slips up again." "So we just wait?" Alara said. "Wait for Hale to make his next move?" I'm sorry, Alara. I know it's not what you want to hear, but my hands are tied unless I've got proof. Alara wanted to scream, wanted to throw something, but she just nodded stiffly. Thanks for telling us. Tom put his hat back on. I'll keep digging, and I'll make sure I'm around during the hearing. If anything happens, I'll be there. He left, and Alara stood in the middle of the kitchen, feeling like the walls were closing in again. He's going to win, she said quietly. Even if the survey proves I'm right, Hale's going to bribe or threaten the board into ruling against me. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Not if we expose him first. Alara looked at him. How? We make him show his hand, force him to do something stupid where people can see. That's dangerous. Everything about this is dangerous, but sitting around waiting for him to destroy you is worse. Alara knew he was right. She hated it, but he was right. What do you have in mind? She asked. Colt thought for a moment. We go public. Make noise. Let everyone in Ridge Hollow know what Hale's doing. Make it so he can't operate in the shadows anymore. You think that'll stop him? No. But it'll make it harder for him to get away with it. Alara nodded slowly. All right, let's do it. They started that afternoon. Alara went into town and spoke to everyone who'd listen. She told them about the fire, about Hale's threats, about the man in the saloon who'd bragged about Hale's plans. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked angry. But they all listened. Colt did the same, talking to the ranchers and farmers who lived on the outskirts of town. He didn't mince words. He told them exactly what Hale was trying to do, and he made it clear that if Hale succeeded with Alara, he wouldn't stop there. He's going to come for all of us eventually, Colt said. One by one, he'll pick us off, unless we stand together. By the end of the day, word had spread through Ridge Hollow like wildfire. People were talking, arguing, taking sides. And for the first time, Hale's name wasn't spoken with respect. It was spoken with suspicion. Alara and Colt rode home together as the sun set, and Alara felt a grim sort of satisfaction. Think it'll work? She asked. I think it's the best chance we've got. And if it doesn't? Colt looked at her. Then we fight anyway. Alara nodded. She was tired of being afraid, tired of waiting for the next blow to fall. If this was going to end, it was going to end on her terms. The hearing was rescheduled for the following week. Alara spent the days leading up to it in a state of constant tension. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. She just worked, throwing herself into the ranch with a kind of desperate energy, like if she kept moving, she wouldn't have time to think about what might happen. Colt stayed close, working beside her, not saying much, but always there. And at night, when the fear got too big to hold inside, he'd pull her close and remind her that she wasn't alone. We're going to get through this, he'd say, and Alara would nod, even though she wasn't sure she believed it. The day before the hearing, Alara received a letter. It was hand-delivered by a boy she didn't recognize, who rode up on a mule and handed her the envelope without a word before riding off again. Alara opened it, her hands shaking. The letter was from Victor Hale. Mrs. Riker, I regret that our interactions have become so contentious. I have always respected your father and believed we could come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. However, it seems you are determined to make this difficult. I am writing to offer you one final opportunity. Withdraw your claim at tomorrow's hearing, accept my offer, and this unpleasantness can end. If you refuse, I cannot be held responsible for what happens next. The frontier is a dangerous place. Accidents happen. People get hurt. I would hate to see you or your husband come to harm. The choice is yours. Sincerely, Victor Hale. Victor Hale. Alara read the letter twice, and then she crumpled it in her fist. Colt came up behind her. What is it? She handed him the crumpled paper. He smoothed it out and read it, his expression darkening with every line. He's threatening us, Alara said. Outright. Yeah, he is. What do we do? Colt folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. We take this to Tom. It's not a confession, but it's close enough. And we show it to the board tomorrow. Let them see what kind of man they're dealing with. You think they'll care? I think some of them will. And that might be enough. Alara nodded. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the hope that justice still meant something in Ridge Hollow. But she'd learned the hard way that hope wasn't always enough. The morning of the hearing, Alara put on her best dress for the third time and braided her hair with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Colt was waiting for her outside, already mounted. He looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "You look strong," he said. "I don't feel strong." "You are, even when you don't feel it." Alara climbed onto her horse, and they rode into town together, side by side. The courthouse was packed. It seemed like half of Ridge Hollow had shown up, some to support Alara, some to support Hale, and some just to watch the spectacle. Alara felt their eyes on her as she walked in, and she forced herself to keep her head high. Colt stayed close, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. They took their seats, and a few minutes later, Victor Hale walked in with his lawyers. He saw Alara and smiled, the same cold, calculating smile he always wore, and she felt her stomach turn. The county board filed in, and the hearing began. Aldridge called the room to order. "We're here to finalize the boundary dispute between Mrs. Alara Riker and Mr. Victor Hale. Both parties have submitted surveys, and we've had time to review them. Before we make our determination, does either party have anything to add?" Alara stood. "Yes, I'd like to submit this." She handed over Hale's letter. Aldridge read it, his eyebrows rising. He passed it to the other board members, who read it in silence. "This is a letter from Mr. Hale," Aldridge said slowly. "In it, he appears to be making threats." Hale stood, looking unruffled. "That letter was taken out of context. I was simply expressing concern for Mrs. Riker's safety. The frontier is dangerous, after all." "It reads like a threat," one of the ranchers on the board said. "Then it was poorly worded. But I assure you my intentions were purely protective." Alara wanted to scream. He was lying, and everyone in the room knew it, but he was doing it so smoothly that it almost sounded plausible. Colt stood. "May I speak?" Aldridge nodded. "Go ahead, Mr. Riker." Colt's voice was calm and steady. "Hale's been trying to force my wife off her land since the day her father died. He's made offers. He's filed disputes. And when none of that worked, he started making threats. The fire that nearly destroyed her barn? That wasn't an accident. One of Hale's men was overheard bragging about it in the saloon. And now this letter. If this board rules in Hale's favor, you're not upholding the law. You're rewarding a man who's been breaking it." The room erupted in murmurs. Aldridge banged his gavel. "Order, order," Hale's lawyer stood. "These are serious accusations, and they're completely unfounded. Mr. Hale has done nothing illegal. He simply exercised his legal right to dispute a boundary line that was improperly documented." "The boundary line was properly documented," Alara said, her voice rising. "My father had it surveyed. We've had it resurveyed. The fence is exactly where it should be. Hale is lying, and you all know it." Aldridge held up a hand. "Mrs. Riker, please. We'll deliberate and make our decision." "When?" "We'll convene in an hour and deliver our ruling." The board members filed out, leaving the room in tense silence. Alara sat back down, her heart pounding. Colt put his hand on her knee, grounding her. "We did what we could," he said quietly. "It might not be enough. Maybe. But we'll deal with that if it happens." The hour passed like a lifetime. Alara sat there, surrounded by people, and felt utterly alone. She thought about her father, about the years he'd spent building this ranch, and she wondered if he'd be proud of her for fighting or disappointed that she'd let it come to this. Finally, the board returned. Aldridge stood. "We've reached a decision." The room went silent. "After reviewing both surveys and considering the evidence presented, we find that Mrs. Riker's claim is valid. The boundary line will remain as it currently stands. Mr. Hale's claim is denied." Alara felt the world tilt. She'd won. She'd actually won. The room erupted in noise, some people cheering, others protesting. Hale stood, his face a mask of controlled fury, and walked out without a word. Alara turned to Colt, and he was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "You did it," he said. Alara laughed, the sound shaky and disbelieving. "We did it." He pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his chest, feeling the tension drain out of her all at once. It was over. Finally, it was over. Oswat. They left the courthouse to a crowd of well-wishers. Samuel clapped Colt on the back. One of the women from town hugged Alara so hard she could barely breathe. Tom Grady stood off to the side, grinning like he'd won a bet. "Congratulations," he said. "You earned it." Thanks, Tom. He tipped his hat and walked off, and Alara and Colt made their way through the crowd to their horses. But before they could mount up, Victor Hale appeared, blocking their path. Alara tensed, but Colt stepped forward, putting himself between her and Hale. Move, Colt said. Hale smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You think you've won, but this isn't over. Yeah, Colt said. It is. I'll appeal. I'll file another dispute. I'll find a way to take what's mine. Colt's voice dropped, low and dangerous. That land was never yours, and if you come near my wife again, you'll regret it. Hale's smile faltered. He looked at Alara, then back at Colt, and something in his expression shifted. He'd underestimated them. Underestimated her. And now he was realizing that he'd lost more than just a legal battle. We'll see, Hale said finally. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Alara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. You think you'll try again? Maybe, but it won't matter. We'll be ready. Alara nodded. She believed him. For the first time, she truly believed him. They rode home as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, and Alara felt lighter than she had in months. That night they sat on the porch, drinking whiskey from a bottle Colt had been saving for a special occasion. To victory, Colt said, raising his glass. Alara clinked hers against his. To survival. They drank, and the whiskey burned going down, but it felt good, felt like celebration. What happens now? Alara asked. Colt looked at her. What do you mean? With us. With this. She gestured between them. We got married to save the ranch, but the ranch is saved, so what happens now? Colt set his glass down and turned to face her. That depends on what you want. Alara's heart was pounding. What do you want? I want this to be real, not just on paper. I want us to be real. Alara felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears this time. I want that too. Colt smiled, and it was the most genuine, unguarded smile she'd ever seen from him. Then that's what we'll do. He leaned in and kissed her, slow and deep, and Alara felt like she was finally home. When they pulled apart, she said, I'm still scared. I know, but I'm not running. Good, because neither am I. They sat there side by side, watching the stars come out one by one, and Alara realized something. She'd spent so long thinking that strength meant doing everything alone, that needing someone made her weak, but she'd been wrong. Strength wasn't about doing it alone. It was about knowing when to let someone in, when to trust, when to fight together instead of apart. And she'd found that in Colt. Not because he was perfect. He wasn't. Not because he had all the answers. He didn't. But because he'd shown up. Because he'd stayed. Because when the world tried to break her, he'd stood beside her and refused to let it happen. That was what mattered. Not grand gestures or perfect moments. Just this. Just showing up. Just staying. Bisag. The weeks that followed were some of the best of Alara's life. She and Colt settled into a routine that felt less like an arrangement and more like a partnership. They worked the ranch together, making improvements, expanding the herds, fixing up the house. Colt moved his things from his old cabin to hers, not all at once, but gradually, until one day Alara realized that his place had become their place. The neighbors continued to check in, and slowly, Alara found herself becoming part of the community in a way she never had before. She'd always been on the outside, looking in, but now people invited her to gatherings, asked her opinion, treated her like she belonged, and maybe she did. Victor Hale kept his distance. There were rumors that he'd left Ridge Hollow entirely, heading east to find new opportunities. Alara didn't know if it was true, and she didn't care. He was gone, and that was enough. One evening, about a month after the hearing, Alara and Colt were sitting on the porch when she said, I've been thinking. About what? About expanding. There's a piece of land to the west, about 50 acres, that's been sitting empty for years. I was thinking we could buy it. Add it to the ranch. Colt raised an eyebrow. We? Alara smiled. Yeah, we. If you're interested. I'm interested. Good, because I can't do it without you. Colt looked at her, and there was something soft in his expression. You could, but I'm glad you don't have to. Alara reached over and took his hand. Me too. They sat there in comfortable silence, and Alara thought about how far she'd come. A few months ago, she'd been alone, terrified, and on the verge of losing everything. Now she had a partner, a home, a future. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, days when the work felt overwhelming, when money was tight, when old fears crept back in. But she wasn't facing those days alone anymore. And that made all the difference. But as winter approached, Alara and Colt worked to prepare the ranch for the cold months ahead. They stockpiled hay, reinforced the barn, and made sure the animals had shelter. It was hard work, but they did it together, and there was something deeply satisfying about it. One night, after a long day of work, they were lying in bed, and Alara said, "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if I hadn't come to you that day?" Colt was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, sometimes." And? "And it would have been lonely." Alara turned to look at him. "You weren't lonely before?" "I was. I just didn't realize it." She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I'm glad I came to you." "Me too." They lay there in the dark, and Alara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. She'd spent so much of her life fighting, fighting to survive, fighting to keep the ranch, fighting to prove she was strong enough, and she'd won those fights. But the real victory wasn't in proving anything to anyone. It was in learning that she didn't have to fight alone. By the time winter fully set in, the ranch was thriving in a way it hadn't in years. Alara and Colt had bought the western parcel, adding 50 acres to their property. They'd hired a couple of hands to help with the work, young men from town who were eager to learn. The herds were healthy, the land was productive, and for the first time in a long time, Alara felt like she could breathe. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Colt said, "You know, I never thought I'd have this." "Have what?" "A home, a family, someone to build a life with." Alara looked at him. "You have it now." "I know, and I'm grateful for it every day." Alara smiled. "Me too." They sat in silence, watching the flames dance, and Alara thought about the journey that had brought them here. It hadn't been easy. There had been pain and fear, and moments when she'd thought she wouldn't make it, but she had. They had. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the destination, but the fact that they'd made the journey together. Spring came early that year, bringing with it new growth and new possibilities. Alara stood on the porch one morning, looking out at the land she'd fought so hard to keep, and she felt a surge of pride. This place was hers, not because of a piece of paper or a legal ruling, but because she'd earned it, because she'd refused to give up, even when everything seemed impossible. Colt came up beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Just how far we've come." He kissed the top of her head. "We've got a long way to go still." "I know, but I'm not scared anymore." "Good." They stood there together, watching the sun rise over the hills, and Alara realized something. She'd spent so long thinking that strength meant being invincible, that asking for help was a weakness, that needing someone made her less. But she'd been wrong. True strength wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about knowing when to reach out, when to trust, when to let someone stand beside you instead of always standing in front. And that's what she and Colt had built. Not a perfect life, but a real one. One forged in hardship and held together by trust and loyalty and something that felt a lot like love. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd chosen. And that made all the difference. The months passed, and the ranch continued to grow. Alara and Colt worked side by side, building something that was bigger than either of them alone. They expanded the herds, improved the land, and established a reputation as fair, hard-working ranchers who kept their word. People in town treated them with respect now, not because of who their families had been or how much money they had, but because they'd proven themselves. They'd stood up to a bully, fought for what was theirs, and come out the other side stronger. One afternoon, Alara was in town picking up supplies when she ran into Samuel. "Mrs. Riker," he said, tipping his hat. "Good to see you." "You too, Samuel. How's your place doing?" "Well enough. Better now that Hale's gone." Alara nodded. "Yeah, it's been quieter." Samuel studied her for a moment. "You know, your father would be proud of you." Alara felt her throat tighten. You think so? I know so. He always said you had more grit than anyone he'd ever met, and he was right. Alara smiled, blinking back tears. Thank you, Samuel. That means a lot. He nodded and walked off, and Alara stood there for a moment, letting his words sink in. Her father would be proud. She'd saved the ranch. She'd built a life. She'd found someone who saw her for who she was and loved her anyway. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. That night, Alara and Colt sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. Do you ever think about the future? Alara asked. All the time. What do you see? Colt was quiet for a moment. I see us here, still working the land, maybe with kids running around, if that's something you want. Getting old together, building something that lasts. Alara smiled. I'd like that. Yeah? Yeah. Colt pulled her close, and they sat there in the dark, wrapped in each other's warmth, and Alara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, solid hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind that clings to anything, but the kind that comes from knowing you've survived the worst and come out stronger. I love you, she said quietly. Colt turned to look at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. Say that again. I love you. He kissed her, long and deep, and when he pulled back, he said, I love you too. Alara laughed, the sound light and free. Took you long enough to say it. I've been saying it, just not with words. I know. They sat there until the cold drove them inside, and as they walked through the door, Alara looked back at the land one more time. This place had tested her, broken her, rebuilt her. And in the end, it had given her something she'd never expected to find. A home, a partner, a life worth living. She'd started this journey alone, terrified and desperate. But she wasn't alone anymore, and she wasn't desperate. She was strong. Not because she'd done it all herself, but because she'd learned to let someone in, to trust, to build something together, and that, more than anything, was the real victory. Book. Years later, when people asked Alara about how she'd saved the ranch, she'd always say the same thing. I didn't save it, we did. Because that was the truth. She couldn't have done it alone. She'd needed Colt's strength, the community's support, and her own stubborn refusal to give up. But more than that, she'd needed to learn that asking for help wasn't weakness, that needing someone wasn't failure, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you couldn't do it alone. The ranch thrived under their care. They expanded it, improved it, made it into something her father would have been proud of. They had children, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up running through the fields, learning to ride, learning to work the land. And through it all, Alara and Colt stood side by side, partners in every sense of the word. There were hard times, of course, droughts and harsh winters and years when the money was tight. But they faced those times together, and that made all the difference. On their 10th anniversary, Colt gave Alara a gift. It was a small wooden box, hand-carved, with her initials on the lid. Inside was the contract they'd signed all those years ago, the one that had laid out the terms of their marriage. I thought we should burn it, Colt said. Alara looked at him, confused. Why? Because it doesn't apply anymore. Hasn't for a long time. Alara smiled. No, it hasn't. They burned it that night, watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames, and Alara felt like she was closing a chapter. The arrangement was over, had been over for years. What they had now was real. Built not on contracts or necessity, but on choice, on love, on the decision to keep showing up day after day no matter what, and that was worth more than any piece of paper. Alara often thought about the woman she'd been when she first rode out to Colt's cabin. Desperate, angry, afraid. She'd been so sure that she had to do everything alone, that needing help made her weak, that letting someone in would only lead to more pain. But she'd been wrong. The truth was, life was hard. The frontier didn't care if you were strong or weak, brave or scared. It tested you either way, and the only way to survive, really survive, was to find people who'd stand beside you when things got bad. People who'd show up, who'd stay, who'd fight for you even when you couldn't fight for yourself. That's what Colt had done for her, and that's what she'd learned to do for him. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about never needing help. It was about building something together, about choosing every day to be there for each other. That was the lesson. Not that you had to be invincible, but that you didn't have to be. Because sometimes the strongest thing you could do was admit you needed someone, and then let them help. One evening, many years later, Alara sat on the porch with her grandchildren, watching the sun set over the hills. Tell us about Grandpa, one of them said. About how you met. Alara smiled. You want the whole story? Yeah. She looked out at the land she'd fought so hard to keep, the land she and Colt had built a life on, and she said, All right, it starts with a deal. And a desperate woman who didn't know she was about to find exactly what she needed. And as she told the story, she thought about how funny life was. How the things you thought would destroy you sometimes ended up saving you. How the people you married out of necessity sometimes became the loves of your life. How sometimes the best things came from the worst circumstances. She'd started with nothing but a ranch and a lot of fear. And she'd ended up with a family, a partner, and a life she never could have imagined. Not because it was easy, but because she'd refused to give up. Because she'd learned to let people in. Because she'd found someone who saw her at her worst and chose to stay anyway. That was the real story. Not about winning or losing, but about showing up, about choosing, about building something that lasted. And in the end, that was all anyone could really ask for. A life built on choice, on trust, on love that wasn't perfect but was real. Alara looked over at Colt, who was working in the barn, and she smiled. They'd come a long way from that first awkward conversation on his porch, from the marriage of convenience that neither of them had wanted. They'd built something real, something lasting, something worth fighting for. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.
What was the other thing I was doing? There was something else. All right. Order, make, sub, and save. Order of cats' food. And then finish front side of sleeveless top. Start Etsy. Oh, those are some interesting emotes, Keisha. Fly back to Mateo. And then I was gonna see what else. Make uh 3D modeled keycap. And then I was going to hmm decipher pros cons of Toronto vacay. Okay. I added more to my list. A lot, but we added more. And some of them are side quests that I'm wanting to start very soon.